This video is about melody, how to compose and develop a melody and applying this to a string quartet. Sometimes it can be difficult to find that bit of inspiration to get your piece off the ground. Here's an idea you could try which will result in you composing a short melody. First of all, pick 4 chords and write down the single notes that make up those chords underneath. For example, D minor is made up of the notes D, F and A. A B flat chord made up of the notes B flat, D and F. An F chord made up of the notes F, A, C. And finally a C chord made up of the notes C, E and G. Now pick one note from each of the chords you chose. For example, using mine, the notes I am choosing are F, B flat, C and E. Now while continually counting 1, 2, 3, 4, practice playing each of those notes on the first beat. For example, on the F, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. And these will be the starting notes to your melody. Now the next step is to add some passing notes to get from your first note, mine was F, to your second note, mine was B flat. Here's an example. And now I want to add some passing notes to get from my second note, which was B flat, to my third note, which was C. Here's an example. Lastly, to finish the melody off, I need to get some more passing notes to get from my third note to my fourth note. Here's an example. One final idea you could add to this is what's called an anacrusis, and this is just one or a few notes that come before the first beat at the very start of your melody. So at the start I had F, so the little pickup or anacrusis before that could be this. You now have a melody. I did this exercise with the starting notes from the chords coming in after every 4 beats. But you could do the same exercise and compose a melody over different numbers of beats. For example, every 2 or 3. That was just one way of demonstrating how to make a melody. But when we're composing, the melody should reflect the mood of the music you want to create. The combination of notes you choose for your melody, together with their rhythms, really help to do this. For example, if you want a happy and uplifting sounding melody, you may want to use notes from a major scale. For example, these are the notes in a D major scale. And here's a really short melody using those notes. Or for a different example, for a more dreamy sounding melody, you may use notes from a whole tone scale. Now a whole tone scale uses these notes. Here's an example of a really short melody using notes from a whole tone scale. Choosing other scales will give different characteristics to your melodies. As we have seen, a major scale can give your piece a happy, uplifting character, and the whole tone scale tends to create dreamy, otherworldly type of melodies. A minor scale, such as D minor, will give your melody a sad and more reflective character. Here's the notes from a D minor scale. And here's an example of a melody using notes from that scale. Another scale is the blues scale. Here's an example of a blues scale. And here's an example of a melody using notes from that scale. You can then experiment with choices of rhythm and harmony to support and extend or to contrast with this character in your music. Now you have a melody, it's important to show how you can develop your music from this idea. And there are lots of little tricks you can do to develop a melody that composers used centuries ago and still use today. For example, one of the simplest ways to develop a melody is to change a few of the pitches or rhythms. Remember my melody from before? Well, here it is again with a few pitch and rhythm changes. It's different, but you can certainly hear how it relates to the original melody. Another way of developing a melodic idea is by playing a passage of notes in a sequence. This is when a composer more or less repeats a passage of music, but starting at a higher or lower pitch than the original. For example, here's the very beginning of my melody. Now, if I play this in a sequence, it could sound like this. Another technique composers often use to develop their melodies is to play them in reverse, and this is called in retrograde motion. For example, here's the very beginning of my melody again. Now, if I play this in retrograde motion, it would sound like this. One final composition technique to develop a melodic idea is to use what's called inversion. And this is where the melody is turned upside down. Probably best to show you in music notation. Have a listen to this melody. To invert it, it would sound like this. Let's demonstrate a few ways composers use some of the melodic ideas we've just talked about within a string quartet piece. One of the most obvious things to consider is if the string players are using the bow, arco, or plucking the strings, pizzicato, to play a melody. Here's an example of a melody being played pizzicato by the viola at the start of a piece called Strum by Jessie Montgomery. And here's a different melody played shortly after by the cello. You might also want to consider which instrument you'd like to play a particular melody because of how high or low that instrument is able to play. For example, that previous extract was a low-pitched melody, so the cello is the perfect choice to play it. I mentioned earlier about developing a melody by changing a few of the pitches and rhythms. In this next example, the violin plays a slightly different version of the cello melody we just heard. Much later in the same piece, the composer uses retrograde motion and inversion to a three-note melodic motif to create a really interesting section of music. First of all, take a listen to the three-note motif played by the viola. This short motif is actually the first 3 notes of the longer cello melody we heard at the beginning, but this time starting on a different pitch and being played in reverse, retrograde motion. The second violin then echoes an inverted version of this 3-note motif. The cello joins in with the second violin, playing the same notes but in an octave lower. Meanwhile, the first violin is playing pizzicato chords to add some texture and harmony to the music. Let's take a listen to that passage of music all together. One final way of using and developing melodic ideas that you often find in a string quartet is the use of imitation. This is when a melodic idea is passed between all the instruments in the quartet. For example, take a listen to this short tune from a string quartet composed by Dmitri Shostakovich. Throughout the piece, Shostakovich uses a short motif made up of just 4 notes which sound like this. Then you hear this motif pop up every now and again, sometimes being passed around all the different instruments in the quartet. This passing around of the motif between the different instruments is imitation. Have a look at this passage of music from the second movement. Let's hear the quartet play this very slowly at first so we can identify the motif being passed around the instruments. Can you hear? It starts in the cello, then passed to the viola, then the second violin, then the first violin, and so on. Let's hear it now at its correct tempo. These are just a few ways you can create melodies and develop them. Take a look at some of our other videos on how to compose for a string quartet. We're really looking forward to seeing what you produce.